Oh, hello. What if I told you the newest research on ADHD and autism is rewriting everything we thought we knew about self control, sensory overload, diagnosis, emotional regulation, gender differences, and even how workplaces judge us? Some of these studies explain late diagnosis more accurately than anything published in the past decade. So, hopefully, by the end of this video, you will walk away with some clear, plain English summaries of 15 new studies from this year. You will know who wrote them, what they found, and the most interesting statistics or facts that came out of these. Also, we cover off a little bit of the limitations or biases, so you should keep those in mind. Nothing fluffy, just some real science that makes sense for neurodivergent brains. So, hello! I am your neurofabulous friend, late diagnosed AuDHD, and today I'm bringing you research with the intensity of someone who once hyper-focused on legal textbooks as a relaxing hobby. I work in health, safety, and risk. I am neurodivergent myself, and I am hyperfixated on kind of translating scientific research into something humans, real humans, can actually read and understand. Now, before we dive straight in, your kind of call to action is in two parts. First, you would have seen all over the Instagrams, on the LinkedIns, on the socials, I have just published my first book. Bonkers. The link is down below. It's pretty fucking cool. And if you are neurodivergent or work with someone who is neurodivergent, I have a ton of freebies on the site, literally free shit. You can go and download it, guides, templates, planners, tools you can use today. So go do that. It's literally free. And while you're there, buy the book. Oh. Okay, why is my hair so spindly? Ugh. Okay, we'll come back to that. I don't know. All right, so while we're here as well, please like and follow and subscribe so we can share this with people far and wide so that they can really start understanding the science behind their brain. And it also helps keep the channel growing. Thanks. Okay. So we're going to start with ADHD research. There's a bit of ADHD, ADHD, autism. We've got a little bit of everything, but we're going to start with ADHD because I think probably there was the most in there. So the first one we're looking into is investigating self-control strategies in ADHD. So Richard et al. 2025 had a university-based study exploring how students with ADHD try to manage academic demands. The researchers compared the strategies they used with the strategies that actually helped. The key takeaways were that ADHD struggles are not about willpower. The strategies people default to do not match their cognitive profile, and environmental structuring and time blocking worked the best. So what was really interesting was environmental modification had the strongest correlation with meeting academic goals. It outperformed motivation strategies by a considerable margin. The limitations, however, were that it was only a university population study and it was self-reported behavior, which may not match necessarily real behavior. The next one we have is TDCS and mindfulness for ADHD. And this was by Mikhaili et al. 2025, and it was a clinical study testing whether combining non-invasive brain stimulation with mindfulness improves working memory and ADHD symptoms in adults. The combined approach worked better than either intervention on its own. The improvements were most notable in cognitive stability, supports multimodal treatment rather than medication alone. And working memory improved the most in combined treatment group compared with the control groups. Couple of limitations though, it was a small sample, it was a short time frame, and there was no long-term follow-up. So take that one with a grain of salt. Emotional dysregulation, medication, meta-analysis. So Amiri et al. 2025, a review of existing medication research for emotional dysregulation in ADHD split by sex and ADHD subtype. So as we know, there's kind of three. There's inattentive, hyperactive, and combined. So the key takeaways here was medication effectiveness is different for males and females. Now this is interesting. Females often respond better to non-stimulant medications. Fascinating. Combined subtype ADHD responded most consistently. Now, one of the most interesting statistics out of this paper was females showed significantly stronger improvement on specific non-stimulant medications, yet most clinical trials underrepresent women. The limitations here included dependent on the quality of existing studies, and very few original studies include enough female participants. So this is one I would love to see pushed further. I would love to know more about this one. All right, AuDHD symptom experiences across gender. Loudermilk Jr. 2025. This was a qualitative study exploring how AuDHD impacts men and women differently in social and professional settings. Women report higher masking, burnout, and self-blame, and men reported more outward frustration but lower awareness of emotional overload. Gendered social expectations shape diagnosis and coping. What was most interesting here is women described lifelong masking that delayed their diagnosis until adulthood, often after burnout. The limitations here was it was a qualitative sample and it wasn't necessarily generalizable. So again, take it with a pinch of salt. All right, ADHD across hormonal life stages. Hello, is someone going into like perimenopause? Because I'm like getting old now. This one kind of went, woo, this could be interesting. So, Orsanalis et al. 2025. There was a large survey examining ADHD symptom patterns across hormonal stages, including menstruation, pregnancy, postpartum, and perimenopause. Estrogen fluctuations heavily influence ADHD symptoms. Interesting. The late luteal phase, postpartum, and perimenopause are peak difficulty points. Many participants were diagnosed only when hormonal changes made coping strategies collapse. Perimenopause, girl. Most interesting statistic was the late luteal phase was reported as the period with the highest symptom intensification across the whole sample. Fascinating. Now, again, couple of limitations. It was self-reported symptoms and it was a cross-sectional design. So just keep those in mind when we're reading more about this. All right, so now just remember, if you're finding this helpful, hit subscribe, follow, like, all that good stuff. There's full research notes down below. I've also actually summarized it into a PDF for you. Like I'm calling it something, I don't know, like cool research from this year, and I'll just summarize it into a doco for you. You can download all of the research. It's cool. Free, just to be clear, free. So subscribe, it's free. Okay, into autism. Auditory accessibility in the built environment. This was really cool. Maciero et al. 2025 showed that engineers, acousticians, I'm guessing people that are skilled in acoustics, and autism researchers collaborated, cool, to understand how buildings affect autistic auditory well-being. I love this already. The key takeaways was sound is one of the biggest sensory barriers for autistic people. It's my worst. Supermarkets, classrooms, and open offices scored lowest for accessibility. The authors created a practical set of 10 design questions, which is actually pretty awesome. Participants rated auditory overload as more distressing than visual overload. I can track with that. What was interesting about this research study is it had a heavy practitioner input and it had a limited large-scale autistic voice representation. So I would love to see this kind of travel out a little bit further as well, because I think it has some really good foundations, especially in the health and safety space where we're looking at accessibility regularly and sound and design. So this would be one for me that I'm really interested to see where it goes next. All right, underrepresentation in pragmatic language. Martin et al. In 2025 did a scoping review examining who is represented in autism communication research. Okay. Most studies in this instance relied on white male samples. Female and minority communication profiles are rarely studied, and diagnostic tools reflect this bias. Interesting. A significant portion of studies did not report on gender or ethnicity at all. I find that quite interesting, and I would love to see this taken further as well. It shows patterns, though, not causation, and it was review based. All right, autism and BPD overlap. Fatma and Assad 2025. This was a narrative review exploring genetic and environmental overlaps between autism and BPD. So I'm guessing borderline personality disorder. There are shared emotional regulation vulnerabilities. There's also lifelong masking and invalidation can create borderline personality-like presentations. And many women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder may actually be autistic or AuDHD, which is actually quite interesting. Masking is named as a major environmental factor in developing BPD, like distress patterns. So the limitations here was it was conceptual only, it was only theoretical, and no new data was collected. So I feel, again, a little grain of salt there. All right. Now, a couple of hard words for me to say, and I'm going to jumble this all up. But Yang 2025 did a research study on creative congruence time in autism care. Again, a conceptual model promoting expressive arts and emotional attunement for autism support. Cool. It moves away from behavioral correction and it centers connection and presence and creates an alternative communication pathway, which I'm super keen on. The CCTV, oh my God, Nicola. The CCT reframes autistic communication as relational rather than impaired. Now, with this research study, no empirical outcomes yet, and also it was conceptual, so we've got to keep that in mind as well. Autism advocacy on Instagram. This is such a hot topic. Like this is a hot button little biscuit. Malik et al. 2025 did an analysis of 364 high engagement autism posts on Instagram. What was interesting is autistic created content drives the most engagement. Themes of unmasking and injustice dominate. Public understanding is being shaped by lived experience. That is pretty cool. And what was most interesting about this research is lived experience posts were the most shared across the entire data set. Now, there's quite a bit of bias here. So there's a high engagement bias. It doesn't reflect lower visibility communities. So just curious to see where this goes. But it was really interesting to show kind of what that kind of data is showing us now. Now this one kind of makes me feel the feels. This is McMahon 2025, and it's the first impressions of autistic job candidates. And it was a study examining how disclosure timing affects employer perceptions. And the first impressions tended to be lower when autistic traits were visible but unexplained. Disclosure after first impressions improved ratings, and early disclosure triggered bias for some or many interviewers. So the most interesting finding out of this was disclosure after first impressions produced the biggest overall positive shift. Limitations included simulated hiring. So it wasn't like a real life experience, and it doesn't fully reflect real world behavior, which I think we really need to dive a little bit further into. I think I would be far more curious to understand that a lot more. The next one was from Crompton 2025, Autism Diagnosis and the Double Empathy Problem. It was a conceptual review examining reciprocal communication differences between autistic and non-autistic people. And I know we've spoken about this a number of times on this channel specifically. The communication difficulties were mutual. Autistic people communicate effectively with each other. Diagnostic models need updating in this regard because it's not about communication breakdowns, it's about who we're communicating with. This work challenges over a century of deficit-based theories, which I quite like, but it is conceptual and it's not empirical. So while it challenges all of these deficit-based theories, it's not still quite theoretical and conceptual. So curious to see where this one goes and if we do any more research in this space. Now, this one for me is interesting. So this year, 2025, I got in to Dungeons and Dragons because it turns out that I can immerse myself in my mind in a visual experience where I literally feel like I am doing the thing with my character. So I am there and I can physically imagine the box and I'm opening the box and there's things and there's smoke in the box. And my amazing partner, who is the most incredible DM, explains these things in beautiful detail. And he's like, and the box opens and it creaks as it opens and it's got the smell and there's a comes out of the box, and yeah, it's just amazing. So anyways, I imagine myself in these situations, which I then find fascinating, that there are people in the world that cannot visualize stuff. So aphantasia, you can't imagine pictures in your head. I find this bonkers, but I like, you know, obviously we're going to find stuff that when you can't understand it yourself, especially when your brain doesn't work like that, it's very difficult to understand how someone else's can. How do people just not see the picture? I don't know. Like, it's so confusing for me. Anyway, we digress. So the next research was on autism and aphantasia. So Bled et al. Did some case studies documenting autistic individuals with no visual mental imagery. I'm like, how is this a thing? So, not all autistic people think in pictures. Obviously, we're all neurodivergent. There's differences. I know there's differences, but I just can't imagine it. Aphantasia is more common in autistic populations than assumed. Okay. Cognitive strengths remain intact. Okay. Participants had a strong analytical reasoning despite no mental imagery. Again, awesome, but what? So, taking with a grain of salt though, the limitations here are that there are case studies and it was a very small sample, but I find this fascinating. So there was no differences in that analytical reasoning and cognitive strength. It's just that the visualization was never, there was no mental imagery. Fascinating. Fascinating. All right. Next one. Autism as a prototypical category. So again, this was a theoretical critique of the spectrum model, and this was done by Motron et al. 2025, and it said that autism may be a distinct developmental pathway rather than a gradient, and critiques the trending idea that everyone has traits. It calls for tighter diagnostic clarity and suggests that autism has a core prototype rather than a fluid spectrum. Quite interesting. I'm very curious to see where this one goes. Theoretical only, and it is also highly debated, this one. All right, accuracy of autism portrayals online. Tien et al. 2025 compared social media autism portrayals with the DSM criteria. Okay, let's see where this goes. The key takeaways here was that online autism looks very different to clinical autism. High engagement posts overrepresent certain traits, creates a misunderstanding for both public and self-identification, and the core diagnostic traits were consistently underrepresented in high engagement posts. What was interesting around the limitations here was the focus was on social media only and does not capture offline context. Now, there's a couple more that I kind of wanted to touch on, but I'm going to just kind of link in the comments as well. But there's this case of orphan diagnosis of adult ADHD, and it was really interesting. It was a cluster of papers from India that argued, and other areas, but argued that adult ADHD remains widely unrecognized and poorly integrated into health systems. And these included the need to recognize, understand, and identify and manage adult ADHD in undiagnosed and orphaned clinical entity, challenges in the way forward, and from childhood impairments to delayed diagnostics, a series of adult ADHD cases. Together, these articles highlight similar themes, that most adults who were diagnosed with ADHD later in life had clear impairments in childhood, but these were misunderstood, normalized, or mislabeled as behavioral issues or personality. Many adults only receive ADHD diagnosis when they present to services for depression, anxiety, substance use, or relationship problems. ADHD is found later when clinicians start looking underneath those conditions, which was really interesting. So I've linked those as well. The next one that was really interesting is masking politeness and interaction. So autism and interaction, unmasking and impoliteness. This was really interesting. This work kind of sits at the intersection between pragmatics and politeness research, and it's kind of in this really new space of autism studies. It explores how autistic people navigate social expectations about politeness and how their communication is actually interpreted. Now, autistic masking is often an attempt to adapt to neurotypical politeness norms, and that can feel opaque or exhausting. It's important because for workplaces, this research supports the idea that professionalism and politeness are also kind of like cultural codes. If we treat them as neutral or universal, we risk pathologizing autistic communication and rewarding superficial masking and essentially over genuine clarity. Now, there was one last study which I thought was really interesting. It was kind of who gets to be autistic. And the study was called Autismness Does Not Exist, but Autism Does. Part 1, a critic of the spectrum position used to describe, diagnose, and research autism and its alternative, and kind of challenges the way we talk about autism spectrum. And the authors argue that treating autism as a loose dimension or a set of traits spread through the entire population risks diluting clinical clarity. And the authors suggest that autism is better understood as a distinct developmental pathway rather than a free-floating set of traits, which is really interesting. It matters because for late diagnosed adults who have had their identity questions with phrases like, aren't we all just a little bit autistic? This paper provides a really clear counter-argument from within the research community. And at the same time, the paper has provoked a debate, especially among those who value dimensional models for capturing diversity. It's really interesting. There's also the gendered experiences of AuDHD. So one of them was exploring the impact of symptoms associated with ASD and Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, so ADHD, as related to males and females. And I think this one's always interesting. This qualitative study explores how AuDHD presents and impacts men and women differently in professional and social life. And I think that one's really interesting to get into. ADHD, gender, and entrepreneurship. This was also really interesting. It's an entire book chapter that looks into how ADHD traits interact with entrepreneurship and gender. And the key takeaways here were that ADHD related traits such as novelty seeking, quick problem solving, comfort with uncertainty can be a real strength in the space. And women with ADHD kind of face double barriers, including underdiagnosis, as we know, and reduced access to capital or networks. Support structures, flexible work patterns, and understanding of neurodivergent regulation can unlock significant entrepreneurial potential. There was also quite a lot of work around leadership and neurodiversity. There was some work that argued that neurodivergent leaders bring unique strengths, including pattern recognition, deep focus, and special interests in creative problem solving. And There was another research study on autistic employees and organizational socialization, where creating inclusive organizational kind of environments through in-depth interviews, etc., kind of explored how autistic employees adapt to new jobs and how colleagues perceive them. Neurotypical colleagues often misinterpret autistic communication as disinterest or aloofness when it actually is anxiety overload or literal thinking. Thought that was pretty interesting. So kind of pulling all the threads together, making sure that we understand that ADHD and autism are not about willpower. Adult ADHD and AuDHD are still under-recognized. Autistic sensory needs are architectural, not just personal. The evidence base and media portrayals are biased. We know this. Communication is a two-way street. Always go into double empathy framework. It's fascinating. Neurodivergent strengths show up in leadership and entrepreneurship, and autism is contested, but a lived experience is also central. So very curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. All right. That was a lot to get through. Bibbidi bobbidi boo. If you want to go deeper, go grab the freebie below. I've literally summarized it for you. It's really interesting. Please subscribe for more research breakdowns and practical tools. Let me know in the comments which study you want me to cover next, or if you've heard of any new studies this year. I'll keep kind of maybe doing a quarterly update on what's happened in the last 3 months in research, because I find it fascinating. You might find it fascinating. I don't know. But yes, thank you for watching. Choose the video on your screen to learn more about AuDHD, masking, burnout, neurodivergent safety, leadership, all these cool things. And I will see you next Saturday, my neurofabulous friends.